I'm a 56-year-old man, and there are moments in life that brand themselves into your memory so deeply that no matter how much time passes, they stay sharp, clear, and painfully alive. And that night was one of them. The night my wife told me not to come to our anniversary dinner. Not shouted, not whispered, not even said with anger, but delivered in a calm, distant voice that felt colder than any argument we had ever had. A voice that sounded like it belonged to someone who had already emotionally packed her bags and left, and I remember standing there in my small home office, phone pressed to my ear, staring at the same framed photo of us from years ago, smiling like we had the whole future figured out, while her words slowly sank in. "Don't come to our anniversary dinner tonight, Richard." And for a few seconds my brain refused to process it. Because who says that? Who tells their husband, their partner of more than 3 decades, not to show up to a night meant to celebrate the very foundation of their life together? And my first reaction was disbelief, a weak, nervous laugh escaping my mouth as I asked her if she was serious, because it sounded like some strange joke that didn't land right. But she didn't laugh back, she didn't soften her tone, she didn't explain herself, she just stayed quiet, and that silence was louder than anything she could have said. Because silence is where the truth hides when someone doesn't want to lie outright. I remember how my chest started to feel tight, not like a sharp pain, but like a slow pressure, as if something heavy had been placed right on top of my heart, and I could feel my pulse in my ears as I waited for her to say more, to give me a reason, an excuse, anything that would make her words make sense. But all she said was that it would be better if I stayed home tonight. And the way she said better didn't sound like concern, it sounded like a decision that had already been made. One I was not part of, and when I asked her why, her answer was vague, slippery, filled with empty phrases about needing space and not wanting to deal with tension. Even though there had been no argument, no fight, no reason for tension at all, and that was when I knew deep down that this had nothing to do with peace and everything to do with avoidance. As I stood there holding the phone, my mind started racing through the past few months, replaying moments I had brushed off, moments that now felt like warning signs I had ignored, because it was easier than facing what they might mean. The way she had become more protective of her phone, the way she smiled at messages she never shared, the way her schedule suddenly filled up with plans that didn't include me, the way she dressed differently when going out alone, and the way she seemed emotionally distant at home, present in body but absent in spirit, and I realized that for a long time I had been living with a woman who was slowly pulling away, while I stayed right where I was, trusting, believing, assuming that 31 years of marriage meant something unbreakable, something solid, something safe. This wasn't just any anniversary either, this was our 31st, a number that carried weight for me, because it represented endurance, history shared sacrifices, nights spent worrying about bills, mornings spent raising kids, years spent building a life that wasn't always perfect but felt real. And just a few weeks earlier, she had been the one pushing for us to celebrate it properly, talking about finding a nice place, dressing up, making it special. Saying we deserved it after everything we had been through together, and I had agreed, feeling a flick of hope that maybe this was a turning point, maybe this was her way of reconnecting, of reminding us who we used to be. So how did we go from that to this sudden command to stay away? How did we go from planning a celebration to being told not to show up at all? And the more I thought about it, the less sense it made, and the more that heavy feeling in my chest turned into something sharper. Something closer to fear. I ended the call without resolution, without understanding, without peace, and I just stood there in that quiet room, phone still in my hand, staring at the wall as if the answers might suddenly appear in the cracks of the paint, and I said her words out loud to myself. Don't come, letting them hang in the air, testing how they sounded when spoken, and they sounded wrong. They sounded like a door closing, like a boundary being drawn, like a secret being protected. And that was when the realization hit me with full force, when someone who once begged for your attention suddenly pushes you away without explanation. It's not because they need space, it's because they don't want you to see something. I walked around the house after that, touching familiar things like I was seeing them for the first time. The couch we picked together, the dining table where we ate thousands of meals, the hallway where our kids used to run when they were little, and everything felt strangely fragile, like a set built to look solid, but ready to collapse if you leaned on it too hard. And I kept asking myself if I should just listen to her, if I should stay home and avoid whatever discomfort was waiting for me out there. Because part of me still wanted to believe her, wanted to protect the image of our marriage, wanted to choose ignorance over pain. But another part of me, a part that had been quiet for too long, started speaking up, reminding me that respect doesn't look like exclusion, that love doesn't hide behind silence, and that trust should never require you to shut your eyes and turn your back. I sat down on the edge of the bed and stared at the clock, watching the minutes pass, each one feeling heavier than the last. And with every passing second, the idea of staying home felt more unbearable, because staying home meant accepting her command without understanding it. It meant choosing comfort over truth. And I'd reached a point in my life where I was tired of living half-aware, tired of sensing something was wrong, but pretending everything was fine. And I realized that night wasn't just about an anniversary dinner. It was about whether I was going to keep shrinking myself to maintain a version of peace that only benefited her. I thought about all the times I had shown up for her without question, all the sacrifices I had made, all the trust I had placed in her hands, and I asked myself a simple but terrifying question: if I don't go, will I ever forgive myself for not wanting to know the truth? And the answer came quickly, heavy and undeniable: no, I wouldn't, because some truths hurt when you discover them, but they rot you from the inside when you avoid them. And I had already spent too long ignoring that quiet voice in my head, telling me something wasn't right. So I stood up, went to the closet, and chose my clothes slowly, deliberately. Like I was preparing for something important, because I was, even though I didn't fully understand it yet. And as I got dressed, my hands trembled slightly, not from fear of confrontation, but from the weight of what might be revealed. And I remember looking at myself in the mirror, really looking, seeing the lines on my face, the tired eyes of a man who had given decades to a marriage he believed in. And I said to myself quietly, "You deserve the truth, no matter what it is." And that sentence felt like permission, like the final push I needed. When I grabbed my car keys and stepped outside, the air felt different, heavier, like the world knew something I didn't yet. And as I got into the car and turned the engine on, I hesitated for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, heart pounding, wondering if this was the point of no return. Because once you choose to see, you can't unsee, and once you step into the truth, your life is never the same. But I also knew that staying parked in the driveway would be its own kind of prison. One built on denial and fear. As I pulled out and started driving toward the restaurant, every mile felt like a countdown, every red light felt like a chance to turn around, and with each one, I asked myself if I was ready for whatever was waiting for me, ready to have my assumptions shattered, ready to face a reality I had been avoiding. And even though my stomach was tight and my thoughts were racing, there was also a strange sense of clarity settling in. Like deep down, I already knew the answer and was finally choosing to stop running from it. A drive wasn't just a drive to dinner, it was a drive toward the truth, toward confrontation, toward the end of a chapter I had been clinging to out of habit and hope. And I didn't know then how painful the night would become, how deeply it would cut, or how completely it would change the direction of my life. All I knew was that when someone tells you to stay away from your own anniversary without a real reason, they are not protecting you, they are protecting a lie. And that night, I chose not to let that lie stand unchallenged, not anymore, not after everything we had shared. And as I turned into the restaurant parking lot, my heart pounding louder than the engine, I had no idea that walking through those doors would expose a truth so raw and undeniable that it would break my heart and save my soul at the same time. Before I tell you what happened that night, you need to understand the man I was for the 31 years leading up to it, because betrayal does not hit the same way when you already expect the worst. It hits hardest when you have spent a lifetime believing in something with your whole heart. And I was that man, the kind who believed loyalty was not optional, not negotiable, but the foundation of everything, the kind of husband who thought if you showed up every day, did your part, and stayed faithful in both actions and intention, then love would naturally survive. And I lived my life by that belief without hesitation, without backup plans, and without ever imagining that it could be used against me. I was never the kind of man who disappeared into his own world or treated marriage like a side responsibility. I showed up. I worked long hours not because I loved work, but because I believed providing stability was one of the ways you show love. And I paid the bills on time, kept the lights on, made sure the mortgage never slipped. And when something broke in the house, I didn't call someone else. I fixed it myself, because that was my role, that was how I contributed, and I took pride in it. Not the loud kind of pride, but the quiet kind that comes from knowing you are dependable. And I remembered birthdays, anniversaries, school events, family obligations, and even the small things like how she took her coffee or which side of the bed she preferred. And I truly believed that all of this added up to something solid, something lasting. When I met Elaine, we were both young, broke, and full of plans that felt endless. The kind of plans you make when you think time is on your side forever. And we didn't have much back then. No money to speak of, no fancy vacations, no backup safety nets, just love, ambition, and the belief that if we stuck together, everything else would fall into place. And in those early years, love felt simple, not easy, but simple, because it was built on shared struggle and mutual hope. And promises felt permanent, because neither of us could imagine a future where we were side by side. And when we got married, it wasn't about a big ceremony or showing off. It was about commitment, about choosing each other, and believing that choice would carry us through whatever came next. Over the years, we built a life piece by piece, slowly and steadily, the way most people do. A house in a quiet neighborhood where nothing exciting ever happened, but where everything felt safe, kids who grew up faster than we expected and eventually moved out to build lives of their own, routines that settled in so deeply they became invisible. And from the outside, we looked like the kind of couple people point to as an example, the ones who made it, the ones who stayed together, the ones who survived the hard years and came out stronger. And I believed that image because I lived inside it every day, and it felt real to me. But trust, when left unchecked, can quietly turn into blindness. And I see that clearly now, even if I couldn't see it then, because I trusted Elaine completely, not because she demanded it, but because I never questioned that she deserved it. And when you trust someone that deeply, you stop asking questions. You stop paying attention to the small shifts. You stop wondering why certain things feel off. Because the idea of betrayal feels so far from your reality that it almost seems insulting to even consider it. And that was where I lived, in a place where doubt felt disloyal and questions felt unnecessary. The signs didn't arrive all at once. They crept in slowly, quietly, the way problems often do when they want to stay hidden, late nights that were explained away as work stress or social obligations, new hobbies and interests that never seemed to include me, a sudden focus on her appearance that didn't match the emotional distance growing between us at home, and moments where she felt physically present but emotionally unreachable, like she was somewhere else even when she was sitting right next to me. And each time I noticed something, I talked myself out of it, told myself I was overthinking, told myself that long marriages go through phases, that not every change means something is wrong. I convinced myself that love evolves, that passion fades and turns into companionship, that silence can be comfortable rather than dangerous. And I clung to those explanations because they were easier than asking hard questions, easier than risking conflict, easier than confronting the possibility that the woman I trusted with my entire life might be slowly building a separate world without me in it. And I told myself that marriage isn't about constant excitement. It's about endurance. About sticking it out even when things feel dull or distant. And while some of that is true, what I didn't understand then was the difference between patience and denial. There were moments when my instincts tried to warn me, moments when something in her tone or behavior didn't sit right, moments when I felt like an outsider in my own marriage. But I pushed those feelings down, because acknowledging them would have meant questioning the very foundation of my life. And I wasn't ready for that kind of reckoning, not after investing 3 decades of effort, loyalty, and belief, because when you give that much of yourself to something, admitting it might be broken feels like admitting you failed, and I didn't want to carry that weight. By the time our anniversary dinner came around, the cracks were already there, running quietly through the structure of our marriage, cracks that had formed over time and widened without me noticing because I refused to look too closely. And on the surface, everything still functioned. We still shared a home, still talked about practical things, still maintained the appearance of normalcy. But underneath, something essential was missing, something unspoken, and I lived with that absence without naming it. Without confronting it, because naming it would have made it real. I see now that silence is not neutral, silence is a choice, and often it is the loudest confession of all, Because when someone stops sharing their inner world with you, when they stop letting you in, it is rarely accidental. But back then, I didn't understand that. I thought silence meant stability. I thought it meant we had reached a place where words weren't always necessary, and I mistook emotional distance for maturity, comfort, and routine. So when she told me not to come to our anniversary dinner, that single sentence didn't just shock me in the moment, it reached back through all those years and shattered the illusion I had been protecting without realizing it. Because in that moment, everything I had ignored, explained away, and dismissed came rushing to the surface at once. And I finally understood that the trust I had been so proud of had slowly turned into blindness. And that blindness had allowed something to grow in the dark, while I stood in the light believing everything was fine. That night forced me to see what I had been avoiding for years, that loyalty without awareness can leave you vulnerable, that love without boundaries can make you invisible, and that sometimes the most painful truths are the ones that have been standing quietly beside you all along, waiting for you to finally open your eyes. And as much as I wish I could say I saw it coming, the truth is I didn't, because I believed too deeply, trusted too completely, and held onto a version of my marriage that existed more in my heart than in reality. And that realization, more than anything else, is what made the betrayal hurt the way it did. I remember sitting in my car outside the house with the engine running, the low hum filling the silence, while my hands rested on the steering wheel like they were gripping the last solid thing I knew. And for a long moment I just sat there, staring straight ahead at the quiet street I had lived on for years, asking myself if I was making the biggest mistake of my life by going against her words. Because part of me still wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation waiting at the end of this drive, something harmless, something awkward but forgivable, maybe a surprise she didn't want ruined, or some private arrangement she wasn't ready to explain. And that part of me clung to hope the way a drowning man clings to a floating board, not because it makes sense, but because it keeps you from sinking too fast. But there was another part of me, a quieter, older part shaped by decades of living beside the same person, and that part knew this wasn't normal. It knew that the way she told me not to come wasn't about romance or surprises, it was about control and avoidance. And as I pulled away from the curb and started driving through streets that felt painfully familiar, streets I had driven 1,000 times without thinking, my chest tightened with every block, my thoughts racing faster than the car. Replaying fragments of conversations from the past few months, the way she had answered questions without really answering them, the way she changed subjects when I pressed too hard, the way her phone was always face down or locked, and how her schedule had slowly filled with gaps I was no longer part of. Houses blurred past my windows, each one a reminder of routine, of normalcy, of a life that had felt stable for so long. And I wondered how many of those homes hid secrets just like mine, how many people were driving toward truths they weren't ready for. And with every mile, the weight in my chest grew heavier, like the air itself was pressing down on me. Because deep down I knew I wasn't just driving to a restaurant, I was driving toward an answer. And answers have a way of changing everything. I thought about turning the radio on to drown out my thoughts, but the silence felt more honest, even if it was uncomfortable. And in that quiet, memories kept surfacing without permission, little moments I had ignored at the time but couldn't escape now. The night she came home later than usual and brushed off my concern. The way she started guarding her privacy in ways she never had before. The sudden shift in how she dressed when she went out alone compared to how she dressed around me. And each memory felt like another piece falling into place, forming a picture I had refused to see until now. As I drove, I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white, and I had to consciously remind myself to breathe, because the closer I got to the restaurant, the more it felt like I was heading straight toward a wall, and part of me wanted to slow down, pull over, turn around, and go back home, back to the safety of not knowing, back to the version of my life where doubt was still just a shadow and not a fully formed threat. And at one red light, I actually did slow to a near stop, my foot hovering uncertainly between the brake and the gas, my heart pounding as I considered making a U-turn right there, telling myself that ignorance might be kinder than whatever waited ahead. In that moment, I imagined myself going home, sitting on the couch, convincing myself that her request made sense, that trust meant respecting her wishes even when they hurt, and pretending I was still the husband who believed without hesitation, the man who didn't need proof, the man who assumed loyalty because he gave it so freely. And for a brief second that fantasy felt tempting, because it promised comfort, familiarity, and the illusion of peace, just as quickly as it appeared. It collapsed under the weight of one simple truth. Peace built on avoidance is not peace at all. It's just a delay. Something inside me refused to let me turn back, a feeling I can't fully explain, like an inner voice that had been quiet for years suddenly speaking up with clarity and force, telling me that once doubt takes root, it doesn't disappear on its own, it grows, it demands answers, and it consumes you slowly if you try to ignore it. And I realized that even if I turned around that night, even if I stayed home and respected her request, I would never truly relax again. I would always wonder what I had missed, what I had chosen not to see, and that curiosity would poison everything anyway. The light turned green, and I pressed the gas, my decision made without words, without ceremony, just action, and as the car moved forward, I felt a strange mix of fear and resolve settle over me. Because I wasn't driving with anger or a plan for confrontation, I was driving with a need for clarity, a need to stop living in uncertainty, and that need felt stronger than my fear of what I might find. The restaurant came into view sooner than I expected, its lights glowing warmly against the darkening sky, looking inviting and ordinary, and that almost made it worse, because everything about the scene suggested a normal, pleasant evening, not the emotional storm brewing inside me. And as I pulled into the parking lot, my heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat, and I sat there for a moment with the engine off, hands still on the wheel, staring at the entrance like it was a doorway into a different version of my life. I thought about all the years that had led me to this moment, all the trust I had placed in her, all the times I had chosen belief over doubt, and I asked myself if I was ready for whatever truth waited on the other side of those doors, ready to have my assumptions challenged, ready to face the possibility that the woman I loved had built a life that no longer included me. And even though my stomach twisted at the thought, there was also a strange sense of calm settling in. Because uncertainty is often more painful than reality, no matter how harsh that reality might be. As I opened the car door and stepped out, the cool air hit my face, grounding me, reminding me that I was still here, still capable of choosing my next step. And I understood in that moment that this drive, this hesitation, this internal battle was not a sign of weakness. It was a sign that I cared, that I had something to lose, and that made what I was about to face meaningful, not shameful. Walking toward the restaurant, I knew that whatever I discovered inside would change things, maybe quietly, maybe dramatically, but permanently. And I also knew that turning back would have changed nothing except prolonging the inevitable. And so I kept walking, carrying 31 years of trust with me, ready, finally, to see whether it had been honored or betrayed. Because that night, whether I liked it or not, I was done living in the dark. And I was ready to face whatever had been hiding behind my wife's calm voice, even if it broke my heart. I remember sitting in my car outside the house with the engine running, the low hum filling the silence, while my hands rested on the steering wheel like they were gripping the last solid thing I knew. And for a long moment I just sat there, staring straight ahead at the quiet street I had lived on for years, asking myself if I was making the biggest mistake of my life by going against her words. Because part of me still wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation waiting at the end of this drive, something harmless, something awkward but forgivable, maybe a surprise she didn't want ruined, or some private arrangement she wasn't ready to explain. And that part of me clung to hope the way a drowning man clings to a floating board, not because it makes sense, but because it keeps you from sinking too fast. But there was another part of me, a quieter, older part shaped by decades of living beside the same person. And that part knew this wasn't normal. It knew that the way she told me not to come wasn't about romance or surprises. It was about control and avoidance. And as I pulled away from the curb and started driving through streets that felt painfully familiar, streets I had driven 1,000 times without thinking, my chest tightened with every block, my thoughts racing faster than the car. Replaying fragments of conversations from the past few months, the way she had answered questions without really answering them, the way she changed subjects when I pressed too hard, the way her phone was always face down or locked, and how her schedule had slowly filled with gaps I was no longer part of. The houses blurred past my windows, each one a reminder of routine, of normalcy, of a life that had felt stable for so long. And I wondered how many of those homes hid secrets just like mine, how many people were driving toward truths they weren't ready for. And with every mile, the weight in my chest grew heavier, like the air itself was pressing down on me. Because deep down I knew I wasn't just driving to a restaurant, I was driving toward an answer. And answers have a way of changing everything. I thought about turning the radio on to drown out my thoughts, but the silence felt more honest, even if it was uncomfortable. And in that quiet, memories kept surfacing without permission, little moments I had ignored at the time but couldn't escape now. The night she came home later than usual and brushed off my concern. The way she started guarding her privacy in ways she never had before. The sudden shift in how she dressed when she went out alone compared to how she dressed around me. And each memory felt like another piece falling into place, forming a picture I had refused to see until now. As I drove, I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white, and I had to consciously remind myself to breathe, because the closer I got to the restaurant, the more it felt like I was heading straight toward a wall, and part of me wanted to slow down, pull over, turn around, and go back home, back to the safety of not knowing, back to the version of my life where doubt was still just a shadow and not a fully formed threat. And at one red light, I actually did slow to a near stop, my foot hovering uncertainly between the brake and the gas, my heart pounding as I considered making a U-turn right there, telling myself that ignorance might be kinder than whatever waited ahead. In that moment, I imagined myself going home, sitting on the couch, convincing myself that her request made sense, that trust meant respecting her wishes even when they hurt, and pretending I was still the husband who believed without hesitation, the man who didn't need proof, the man who assumed loyalty because he gave it so freely. And for a brief second that fantasy felt tempting, because it promised comfort, familiarity, and the illusion of peace, but just as quickly as it appeared, it collapsed under the weight of one simple truth. Peace built on avoidance is not peace at all. It's just a delay. Something inside me refused to let me turn back, a feeling I can't fully explain, like an inner voice that had been quiet for years suddenly speaking up with clarity and force, telling me that once doubt takes root, it doesn't disappear on its own, it grows, it demands answers, and it consumes you slowly if you try to ignore it. And I realized that even if I turned around that night, even if I stayed home and respected her request, I would never truly relax again. I would always wonder what I had missed, what I had chosen not to see, and that curiosity would poison everything anyway. The light turned green, and I pressed the gas, my decision made without words, without ceremony, just action, and as the car moved forward, I felt a strange mix of fear and resolve settle over me. Because I wasn't driving with anger or a plan for confrontation, I was driving with a need for clarity, a need to stop living in uncertainty. And that need felt stronger than my fear of what I might find. The restaurant came into view sooner than I expected, its lights glowing warmly against the darkening sky, looking inviting and ordinary, and that almost made it worse, because everything about the scene suggested a normal, pleasant evening, not the emotional storm brewing inside me. And as I pulled into the parking lot, my heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat, and I sat there for a moment with the engine off, hands still on the wheel, staring at the entrance like it was a doorway into a different version of my life. I thought about all the years that had led me to this moment, all the trust I had placed in her, all the times I had chosen belief over doubt, and I asked myself if I was ready for whatever truth waited on the other side of those doors, ready to have my assumptions challenged, ready to face the possibility that the woman I loved had built a life that no longer included me. And even though my stomach twisted at the thought, there was also a strange sense of calm settling in. Because uncertainty is often more painful than reality, no matter how harsh that reality might be. As I opened the car door and stepped out, the cool air hit my face, grounding me, reminding me that I was still here, still capable of choosing my next step. And I understood in that moment that this drive, this hesitation, this internal battle was not a sign of weakness. It was a sign that I cared, that I had something to lose, and that made what I was about to face meaningful, not shameful. Walking toward the restaurant, I knew that whatever I discovered inside would change things, maybe quietly, maybe dramatically, but permanently. And I also knew that turning back would have changed nothing except prolonging the inevitable. And so I kept walking, carrying 31 years of trust with me, ready, finally, to see whether it had been honored or betrayed. Because that night, whether I liked it or not, I was done living in the dark. And I was ready to face whatever had been hiding behind my wife's calm voice, even if it broke my heart. When I walked into the restaurant, the first thing that hit me was the warm noise of it all, the low hum of conversations, the clinking of glasses, the soft laughter drifting between tables, the kind of place designed to make people feel relaxed and connected. And for a brief moment, I didn't see her, and that almost gave me hope, a small, dangerous spark of it, because my mind rushed to fill the gap with possibilities. Maybe she hadn't arrived yet. Maybe she really did plan something else. Maybe this whole night had been a misunderstanding fueled by my own fear and imagination. And I stood there just inside the entrance, letting my eyes adjust, scanning the room slowly, deliberately, like I was afraid that rushing would shatter whatever fragile hope I still had left. I took a few steps forward, my heart beating hard enough that I could feel it in my neck, and I told myself to stay calm, to breathe, to not jump to conclusions until I knew for sure. And that was when I saw her, sitting at a corner table near the window, positioned just far enough from the rest of the room to feel private, but still very much on display. And the moment my eyes landed on her, something inside me dropped, like the floor had suddenly given way beneath my feet. She looked different, not in a dramatic way, but in a way that only someone who knows you intimately would notice. She was dressed in a way she hadn't dressed for me in years, her hair styled with care, her posture open and relaxed, and there was a softness to her expression that I hadn't seen at home in a long time. And what cut the deepest was her smile, because it wasn't polite or forced. It was genuine, easy, the kind of smile that comes naturally when someone makes you feel seen. And I realized, with a sharp pang, that I couldn't remember the last time she had smiled like that at me. Then I saw the man sitting across from her, and that was when the moment fully shattered, because he wasn't just a stranger passing by or a coworker having a casual meal. He was leaning forward, engaged, laughing softly at something she had just said, his body language open and attentive, the kind of posture that says you care about every word coming out of the other person's mouth, and the way he looked at her, with focus and interest, told me this wasn't his first time sitting across from her like this. In that instant, time seemed to slow down to a crawl, the sounds of the restaurant fading into a dull buzz, my stomach dropping so suddenly it made me feel lightheaded, and my ears started ringing, a high, hollow sound that made everything feel distant and unreal, and I stood there frozen, unable to move, unable to look away, watching the woman I had built a life with act like she was on a first date with someone else, and the shock of it rooted me to the floor. The worst part wasn't even the man himself. It wasn't his face or his presence that hurt the most. It was the ease between them, the comfort that flowed so naturally across the table, the way they leaned toward each other without thinking, the way she reached for her glass at the same moment he paused to let her speak, like he already knew her rhythms, her habits, the small, unspoken things that usually take time to learn, and that familiarity told me more than any kiss or touch ever could. I watched as she laughed again, tilting her head slightly, a gesture I knew well, one she used when she felt relaxed and safe, and it hit me then that this wasn't a random encounter. This wasn't spontaneous. This wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding. This was planned, carefully planned, down to the location, the timing, and the way she had made sure I wouldn't be there. And the realization washed over me with brutal clarity. She didn't just forget about me that night. She intentionally removed me from the picture. I stood there long enough that I worried someone might notice. But no one did, because to everyone else, I was just another man in a restaurant, not someone watching his entire world quietly unravel. And as I took a few steps closer, staying just out of her line of sight, I felt a strange mix of emotions crash over me all at once. Anger, sadness, disbelief, and a deep, aching sense of loss, not just for my marriage, but for the version of my life I had believed in for so long. I thought about all the times I had sat across from her at our own dining table, eating in comfortable silence, mistaking routine for intimacy, and I wondered how long she had been giving this version of herself to someone else, how long this smile had been missing from our home while I convinced myself everything was fine. And with each passing second, the truth became harder to deny. This wasn't just about one dinner, It was about a shift that had already happened. A bond that had been formed somewhere outside our marriage, while I was still standing inside it alone. My body felt heavy, like moving through water, and I had to force myself to take another step, because part of me wanted to turn around and walk out, to spare myself the rest of the pain. But another part of me knew that what I was seeing was exactly what I needed to see, that this moment, as brutal as it was stripping away the last layer of denial I had been holding on to. And I realized that if I had listened to her and stayed away, I would have continued living in a lie. A lie that would have eaten away at me slowly and quietly. As I watched them talk, watched the man nod along, watched her lean in and lower her voice, sharing something private, something intimate, I understood with painful certainty why she had told me not to come, because if I had obeyed her, I would have never witnessed this scene, never felt this truth hit me with such undeniable force, and she could have continued living in both worlds, protected by my trust and my silence. In that moment, standing there unseen, I felt something shift inside me, something harden and something clarify, because betrayal, when you see it with your own eyes, has a way of cutting through confusion and replacing it with clarity. And as painful as that clarity was, it was also grounding, because it left no room for excuses or doubt, and I knew that whatever happened next, whatever words were exchanged or decisions were made, this image would stay with me forever. The image of my wife smiling across a table from another man on the night that was supposed to belong to us. I realized then that love doesn't disappear all at once. It fades in moments like these, in choices made quietly and repeatedly, and watching her before she saw me was like watching the final piece fall into place, a proof I hadn't wanted but desperately needed. And as I stood there, heart pounding, mind racing, I understood that this was the point of no return, because once you see the truth clearly, you can't unsee it, and my life, whether I was ready or not, was about to change forever. She saw me before I could stop myself from staring, and the change in her face happened so fast it almost felt unreal, like watching a mask fall in slow motion, because 1 second she was smiling, relaxed, comfortable in a way I hadn't seen in years, and the next second all the color drained from her face as if someone had flipped a switch inside her. Her smile vanished without warning, her lips parting slightly like she wanted to speak, but couldn't find the words. And her hand froze in mid-movement above the table, fingers curled awkwardly around her glass. And in that instant I knew, without any doubt at all, that she had never expected me to walk through that door. For a brief moment, she just stared at me, eyes wide, breath shallow, like a child caught doing something they knew was wrong. And the man sitting across from her noticed the sudden shift in her expression and turned around slowly, confusion written all over his face, because from his perspective, this was just a normal dinner that had suddenly been interrupted by a stranger. And when his eyes landed on me, standing there in the middle of the restaurant, everything changed. Because recognition doesn't need words, it moves faster than language. And in that moment, 31 years of shared memories passed silently between Elaine and me. We didn't need to speak to understand what was happening, because everything that had gone unsaid for months, maybe years, suddenly filled the space between us, all the late nights, all the excuses, all the emotional distance, all the silences I had misread as harmless, and I felt my heart breaking in a slow, controlled way, not with a loud crack, but with a deep internal collapse, like something giving way under too much weight. And still, I didn't shout, I didn't rush forward. I didn't cause a scene, because anger wasn't what I felt in that moment, clarity was. I took a step toward the table, then another, my legs moving almost on their own, my mind strangely calm despite the storm raging inside my chest, and I could feel the eyes of people nearby drifting toward us, sensing the shift in energy without fully understanding it. And as I reached the table and stopped, standing right beside it, I looked at Elaine, really looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, she couldn't look back at me, because shame has a way of lowering your gaze. Pulling it down toward the floor, like gravity, suddenly got stronger. My voice surprised even me when I spoke, because it didn't shake, it didn't crack, it came out steady and controlled, even though my heart felt like it was tearing itself apart, and I said the words that had been sitting heavy in my chest since the moment I walked in, "Happy anniversary, Elaine," and the simplicity of it made the moment even heavier, because those words belonged to a different version of this night, a version that no longer existed. The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable. The kind of silence that stretches on just long enough to make everyone aware of it. And the man looked from me to Elaine and back again, realization slowly dawning on his face as the pieces fell into place, his posture stiffening as he understood exactly who I was. And I watched his expression change from confusion to embarrassment to something like regret, because even if he hadn't known the full truth before, he knew it now. And knowledge has a way of draining the room of all its ease. Elaine still wouldn't meet my eyes, her shoulders slightly hunched, her body language closed off, defensive, and I could see the internal struggle playing out across her face, the desire to explain fighting with the fear of being exposed, and I realized then that this moment wasn't just about betrayal. It was about cowardice, about choosing secrecy over honesty, comfort over integrity, and watching her sit there unable to look at me was more painful than any argument could have been. Because it told me she knew exactly what she had done. I noticed small details in that moment, things my mind clung to as if cataloging evidence, the way her hand trembled slightly as she finally set the glass down, the way she swallowed hard before taking a breath, the way the man shifted uncomfortably in his chair, suddenly aware that he was sitting in the middle of someone else's marriage, and all of it felt surreal, like I had stepped into a scene that didn't belong to my life, even though it clearly did. I didn't accuse her, I didn't raise my voice, I didn't ask questions yet, because there are moments when words are unnecessary, when the truth stands right in front of you so clearly that anything you say would only weaken it. And instead, I let the silence do the work. Because silence, when it follows exposure, has a way of forcing people to confront themselves. And as I stood there, calm on the outside and breaking on the inside, I understood something important about myself. I wasn't there to beg, to plead, or to fight for attention. I was there to reclaim my dignity. The man finally spoke, his voice hesitant, apologetic, saying he didn't know that he was sorry, and I believed him because his discomfort was genuine, unlike Elaine's carefully controlled quiet. And I nodded at him, acknowledging his words without anger, because my anger wasn't meant for him, it was meant for the person who had made a choice to sit across from him on a night that was supposed to belong to us. Elaine finally looked up then, just for a second, our eyes meeting briefly before she looked away again. And in that fleeting glance I saw fear, regret, and something else I couldn't quite name, maybe relief that the secret was finally out, because carrying a lie for too long can exhaust even the person who benefits from it. And I realized that this moment, as devastating as it was for me, might have been inevitable, because secrets have a way of demanding exposure sooner or later. Standing there in that restaurant, surrounded by strangers who had no idea they were witnessing the collapse of a 31-year marriage, I felt an unexpected sense of resolve settle in, because while my heart was broken, my mind was clear, and clarity is powerful, and I knew that whatever came next, whatever conversations awaited us after we left that place, I would no longer be operating in confusion or denial, I would be operating in truth. That was the moment I understood that betrayal doesn't always come with shouting or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it comes quietly, revealed in a look, a frozen hand, a lowered gaze, and sometimes the most painful part isn't the act itself, but the realization that the person you trusted chose secrecy over honesty and comfort over courage. And as I stood there, having just wished my wife a happy anniversary in front of the man she had replaced me with, I knew that nothing between us would ever be the same again, because once the truth steps into the light, there is no going back to the dark. She tried to explain it right there, and watching her do that was almost harder than discovering the betrayal itself, because there's something deeply painful about seeing someone you love scramble for words that no longer have the power to protect them. And she spoke quickly, nervously, sentences tumbling over each other without direction. Saying it wasn't what it looked like, saying she had been confused, saying she never meant for it to go this far, and that she didn't want to hurt me. And as I listened, standing there beside the table, every word felt hollow, not because she wasn't emotional, but because her explanations arrived far too late to matter. I didn't interrupt her at first, I just listened, watching her eyes dart between me and the man across from her like she was hoping one of us would rescue her from the moment. And I realized how often she must have rehearsed versions of this explanation in her head, just in case something went wrong, just in case she got caught. And that realization stung more than any single sentence she spoke, because it meant she had anticipated this possibility and chosen to proceed anyway. She kept saying she was confused, as if confusion somehow erased intention, as if not knowing what she wanted excused planning an anniversary dinner with another man, and deliberately telling her husband not to show up. And the more she talked, the clearer it became that she wasn't explaining herself to help me understand. She was explaining herself to make the situation feel less severe, less final, less real. And I understood then that explanations given under exposure are rarely about truth. They are about damage control. The phrase "I didn't want to hurt you" repeated itself again and again, and every time she said it, it felt like a small insult, because harm is measured by actions, not intentions. And if she truly didn't want to hurt me, she would have chosen honesty long before this night. She would have had a difficult conversation instead of creating a hidden life. And she wouldn't have placed me in a position where discovering the truth required me to walk into a restaurant and witness it with my own eyes. The man across from her stood up then, his movements awkward and hesitant, his face flushed with embarrassment, and he apologized, his voice quiet and sincere, saying he had no idea she was married, that he wouldn't have been there if he had known. And I believed him, not because I wanted to, but because his shock was genuine. It showed in his posture, in the way he avoided eye contact, in the discomfort written plainly across his face. And in that moment, it became painfully clear who had been honest and who had not. I looked at him, really looked at him, and I didn't feel rage. I didn't feel the urge to lash out or blame him, because he wasn't the one who had promised me 31 years of loyalty. He wasn't the one who had shared a home with me, built a life with me, and planned an anniversary dinner under false pretenses. And that clarity stripped the moment of unnecessary drama and left only the truth. The betrayal was not sitting across from her. It was sitting beside me. I told him calmly that he should leave, my voice steady, controlled, even gentle, because anger in that direction would have been misplaced. And I could see the relief mixed with guilt in his eyes as he nodded, gathering his things quickly, murmuring another apology before walking away. And as he disappeared into the crowd of the restaurant, the space he left behind felt heavier than when he was there, because now there was nowhere left for Elaine to hide. The table suddenly felt smaller, like the air around it had thickened, and without the presence of a third person, the reality of the situation settled in fully, pressing down on both of us. And Elaine sat there, hands clasped tightly in her lap, her shoulders tense, her eyes fixed on the surface of the table, as if looking at me directly might make everything collapse faster. And I realized that this was the moment the lie finally gave up, not with a dramatic confession, but with the quiet removal of every distraction that had allowed it to exist. I asked her then calmly, without accusation, how long it had been going on, and the pause before she answered told me more than the words that followed, because hesitation is often where the truth hides. And when she finally spoke, her voice was softer, stripped of the frantic energy from earlier, and she admitted that it had started as conversations, that she had felt lonely, unseen, disconnected. And while part of me understood those feelings on a human level, another part of me couldn't ignore the choices that followed them. I listened as she spoke, not because I was looking for excuses, but because I wanted to understand how someone could justify betraying a life they helped build. And as she talked, I noticed how carefully she framed her words, how she focused on her emotions rather than her actions, how she avoided numbing things directly. And it became clear that even now, with the truth exposed, she was still trying to soften it, still trying to make it less severe than it was. What struck me most in that moment was not the content of her explanation, but the absence of something I expected to feel. There was no shock left, no disbelief, no confusion, just a deep, steady sadness and a growing sense of clarity, because seeing the lie collapse in front of me stripped it of its power. And without that power, all that remained was the reality I had been avoiding. My marriage was no longer what I believed it to be. The restaurant noise slowly crept back into my awareness, the clinking of glasses, the murmur of conversations, life continuing around us as if nothing significant had happened, and that contrast made everything feel even more surreal. Because for me, the world had just shifted permanently, and for everyone else, it was just another evening out. And sitting there, I realized how isolating betrayal can be, how it can make you feel completely alone even in a crowded room. I told Elaine then that we would not continue this conversation there, that some moments deserve privacy, dignity, and time, and she nodded, relief flickering across her face. And as we stood up from the table, I felt the full weight of what had just happened settle into my body, a tiredness that went beyond physical exhaustion, a weariness that comes from carrying a truth you never wanted to hold. Walking out of that restaurant, the lie finally fully collapsed behind us, leaving no room for denial or excuses, and as painful as that was, there was also something strangely grounding about it. Because lies thrive in uncertainty, and once the truth is exposed, it loses its ability to control you. And in that moment, even though my heart was heavy and my future uncertain, I knew that I was no longer living in confusion. And that clarity, however painful, was the first step toward reclaiming myself. We didn't yell on the drive home, and somehow that made everything worse, because loud anger at least gives pain a shape, something you can point to and say this is where it hurts, but silence has no edges, it just spreads. And that car ride felt endless even though it couldn't have been more than 20 minutes. The headlights cutting through the dark while the space between us grew heavier with every mile, and I kept my eyes on the road, not because I was calm, but because I didn't trust myself to look at her without something breaking loose inside me. She sat in the passenger seat with her hands folded in her lap, staring straight ahead like she was bracing for impact, and the only sounds were the hum of the engine and the occasional passing car. And I remember thinking how strange it was that, after 31 years of sharing everything, we now had nothing to say that wouldn't hurt. And that silence wasn't peaceful. It was defensive. Like two people standing on opposite sides of a line, neither one knew how to cross anymore. Every few minutes, she would inhale as if she was about to speak, then stop herself, and I could feel the tension in her body without even looking. And part of me wanted her to talk, wanted her to explain everything right then and there, so I could either understand it or finally let it shatter. But another part of me knew that anything said in that car would only add to the damage. Because some conversations need walls and time, and the safety of being out of public view. When we finally pulled into the driveway, the house looked the same as it always had, quiet, familiar, steady, and that almost felt cruel, because nothing inside me felt steady anymore. And as we walked in, the normal sounds of the house settling around us felt out of place, like the walls themselves hadn't gotten the memo that something fundamental had just broken. Inside, the truth came out in pieces, not all at once, because she couldn't face it head-on any more than I could, and she talked the way people do when they're afraid of their own honesty, circling around the center instead of stepping into it. And she told me it started as conversations, harmless at first, messages that made her feel noticed, appreciated, listened to, and I sat there listening, not interrupting, not reacting, because I wasn't looking for an argument, I was looking for understanding. Even if that understanding hurt. She said she felt unseen, like she had slowly disappeared in our marriage, like we had become roommates instead of partners. And while hearing that stung, I didn't dismiss it outright, because feelings don't appear out of nowhere. But what hurt most was how she justified what came next, how she convinced herself that emotional closeness with someone else didn't count as betrayal, how she told herself it was temporary, harmless, something she could control. And as she spoke, I realized how easily people can rewrite their own morals when convenience starts to feel better than responsibility. I asked questions, not sharply, not angrily, but carefully, because every answer was a thread pulling at the fabric of our life, and I wanted to know how long, how deep, how real it had become. And she answered slowly, sometimes stopping mid-sentence like she was hearing her own words for the first time. And with every admission, something inside me shifted from shock to resignation, because it became clear this wasn't a sudden mistake. It was a series of choices made over time, each one easier than the last. What struck me most wasn't the details themselves, but the way she talked about them, as if they had happened to her rather than being chosen by her. And that's when I understood something important. Betrayal often comes wrapped in self-pity, because it's easier to see yourself as misunderstood than to admit you crossed a line. And listening to her, I realized that while she felt lonely, she never invited me into that loneliness. She never gave me the chance to see it clearly or address it together. At some point, the conversation just faded out, not because everything had been said, but because we were both exhausted in different ways, and she eventually went to the bedroom, leaving me sitting alone in the living room, the lights off, the house quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar. And that night I didn't sleep, not because I wasn't tired, but because my mind refused to slow down. I sat there in the dark, replaying the night over and over, the restaurant, the look on her face, the explanations that followed, and I realized that our marriage wasn't ending because of one dinner or one man. It was ending because of a slow drift that neither of us had confronted honestly. And while that didn't excuse her actions, it helped me see the bigger picture. This wasn't about a single betrayal. It was about a long series of small withdrawals that eventually emptied the account. As the hours passed, something unexpected happened. My anger softened, not into forgiveness, but into clarity, because anger is loud and blinding, but clarity is quiet and sharp. And I began to understand that shouting, blaming, or seeking revenge wouldn't give me back what I had lost. It would only tie me more tightly to the damage. And for the first time since walking into that restaurant, I felt a strange sense of control returning, not over the situation, but over myself. I thought about revenge then, not in a dramatic sense, but in the way people often do when they're hurt. The urge to make the other person feel what you feel, to even the scale somehow. And I realized that kind of revenge would only keep me trapped in the same emotional space she had created, reactive, defensive, and small. And that's when it hit me. Revenge didn't have to be loud or cruel to be powerful. Sometimes the strongest revenge is reclaiming your dignity, refusing to beg for honesty that should have been freely given, refusing to compete for attention that was once yours by default, and refusing to let someone else's choices define your worth. And sitting there alone in the dark, I made a quiet promise to myself. I would not lose my sense of self in the aftermath of her betrayal. That night changed something in me, not all at once, but enough to set a direction, because while my marriage was clearly wounded, maybe beyond repair, I was still standing, still capable of choosing how I responded. And I realized that how I handled what came next would matter just as much as what had already happened. The quiet war after the dinner wasn't fought with shouting or slammed doors. It was fought internally, in moments of restraint, in choosing reflection over reaction, and in deciding that my future would not be built on bitterness. And as dawn finally began to creep through the windows, I knew that whatever the outcome of my marriage, I was done fighting for someone who had already stepped away, and I was ready, finally, to start fighting for myself. I didn't rush to confront everyone, and that alone surprised even me. Because if you had asked me years ago how I would react to something like this, I probably would have said I'd explode, that I'd demand answers, call family members, expose everything, make noise so loud it couldn't be ignored. But betrayal has a strange way of changing you. And instead of turning outward, I turned inward, not out of weakness, but out of instinct. Because something deep inside me knew that reacting fast would only give away whatever leverage I still had. So I stepped back quietly, legally, emotionally, in a way she never saw coming, and I watched her closely during those first weeks after the dinner. Watched how she moved through the house, how she spoke to me carefully like someone handling fragile glass. And I realized she thought I was still processing, still stunned, still trying to decide what to do, and in a way that was true, but not in the way she assumed. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't ask for her phone, I didn't interrogate her about timelines or details, because the truth was, I didn't need to know everything to know enough, and more importantly, I didn't want her to feel cornered, because people who feel cornered become defensive, and defensive people hide things better, and I needed clarity, not chaos. The first thing I did was meet with a lawyer quietly on a weekday afternoon when she thought I was running errands, and sitting in that office felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unfold on paper. But the lawyer spoke calmly, professionally, explaining options, explaining protections, explaining how stepping carefully now could save years of regret later. And I listened, taking notes, asking questions, not because I was eager to end my marriage, but because I was determined not to be blindsided again. I began organizing my finances, something I had never done alone before, because for decades we had shared everything without question. And as I reviewed accounts, statements, and records, I felt a strange mix of sadness and empowerment. Sadness that it had come to this, and empowerment because knowledge has a way of restoring balance, and every document I organized, every number I understood, felt like another piece of myself coming back. I documented everything, not out of spite, but out of self-respect. Conversations, dates, changes, admissions, because memory becomes unreliable when emotions run high. And I wanted facts, not feelings, to guide my decisions. And I did all of this quietly, without letting it bleed into our daily interactions. Because outwardly, life went on in a muted version of normal. At home, I gave her space, real space. Not the cold, punishing kind, but the kind that lets someone believe they're still in control. And I could tell she interpreted my calm as resignation, maybe even forgiveness. And that wasn't entirely her fault, because when someone expects anger, calm feels like surrender. And she began to relax, began to move more freely, began to assume the worst had passed. That assumption worked in my favor, because people reveal more when they think the danger is gone. And without me asking, she started talking more, explaining more, sometimes even justifying things she hadn't admitted before. And I listened, not as a wounded husband anymore, but as an observer, someone gathering information without emotional attachment. And that shift alone changed everything. During those weeks, I did something else that mattered just as much. I focused on myself for the first time in decades, not in a dramatic way, but in small, steady choices that added up. I started walking every morning not to escape, but to clear my head, feeling the air in my lungs, reminding myself that my body was still strong, still capable, still mine. I reached out to old friends I had slowly drifted away from, men who remembered me before I was defined by my marriage, and those conversations grounded me in ways I didn't expect, because they didn't see me as broken or weak. They saw me as someone going through something hard, and that distinction mattered more than I realized at the time. I paid attention to my health, scheduling appointments I had postponed for years, eating better, sleeping better when I could, because betrayal has a way of making you feel disposable, and taking care of myself was my quiet way of rejecting that idea. And with every small act of self-respect, my anger softened, not into acceptance, but into clarity. That clarity became power, not the kind of power that needs to dominate or punish, but the kind that comes from knowing you can walk away intact. And I began to see the situation for what it was, not a dramatic collapse, but a slow divergence. Two people who had stopped choosing each other long before the restaurant ever came into play. I realized then that the plan she never expected wasn't about revenge in the traditional sense. There was no dramatic reveal, no public confrontation, no scorched earth moment. It was about preparation, patience, and control, about refusing to let her actions dictate my reactions. And in that quiet strategy, I found something I hadn't felt in a long time: confidence. By the end of those weeks, I wasn't the same man who had stood frozen in that restaurant. I was calmer, clearer, and ready. Not because I wanted to hurt her, but because I finally understood my own worth outside of the marriage. And that understanding set the stage for what came next. The moment when silence would give way to action, and the balance of power would quietly, unmistakably shift. The truth came out not through dramatic confrontation or heated arguments, but quietly, inevitably, through honesty. The kind of honesty that builds slowly, carefully, until there is no room left for lies to linger. And it happened weeks later, During a family gathering that should have been simple, ordinary, filled with the casual chatter and laughter of relatives reconnecting, but instead carried an undercurrent of tension I could feel from the moment I walked in. I had prepared myself, not with plans for confrontation, but with a resolve to speak clearly, calmly, and truthfully, and that preparation made the difference between chaos and clarity. As the evening unfolded, the questions started innocently enough. My sister, always perceptive, noticed the quiet distance between Elaine and me and asked what had changed, while my children, now grown, picked up on subtle tensions, glances exchanged, silences stretched longer than they used to, and I felt the weight of all those small observations coalescing into a moment that demanded truth. I could have avoided it, could have given vague answers or diverted attention, but I had learned that honesty, even when it hurts, carries a power that evasion cannot match. So I spoke, carefully, choosing my words with precision, because this wasn't about revenge or humiliation. It was about reclaiming the narrative that had been quietly stolen from me over time. I explained without embellishment what had happened that night at the restaurant, how I had discovered the betrayal firsthand, how our choices over the years had slowly eroded the trust we had built over 31 years. And as I spoke, I could feel Elaine's posture shift, the small ticks of unease that only come when control slips away. Her mouth opened as if she wanted to interject, but she stopped herself, realizing that the moment of control she had clung to for so long was gone. Family members reacted in different ways, some shocked, some quietly processing, others carefully holding their emotions. And for me, it was a strange mix of relief and pain, because while the truth brought validation, it also reopened the emotional wounds that had barely begun to heal. Watching her realize she could no longer manipulate the narrative, could no longer shape reality by withholding facts, was painful but necessary, because silence, as I had come to understand, only protects the person who caused the damage, not the one who suffered it. Elaine's attempts to speak were halting, tentative, as if she had forgotten the words for a moment, realizing that excuses that worked in private no longer held sway in public. And I could see the subtle shift in her eyes, the fear, the regret, the dawning comprehension that her carefully constructed illusion was collapsing, not with loud confrontation, but with the quiet inevitability of truth spoken calmly and consistently. I stayed composed, listening as she faltered, gently allowing the space for her admission without judgment, because this wasn't about shamming her. It was about reclaiming my own integrity and allowing those around us to see reality as it truly was. The room became a space of tentative acknowledgement, people asking questions, seeking clarity, and I answered each one with precision and care, neither embellishing nor minimizing, and in doing so, I felt the immense weight of years of secrecy lift slightly. Every truth spoken openly acted like a small healing agent, not just for me, but for everyone who had been caught in the web of partial knowledge, people who had noticed changes, who had suspected things were amiss but didn't have confirmation. There were moments when Elaine's eyes met mine across the room, fleeting glances loaded with everything unsaid, the fear of exposure, the shame of her choices, the recognition that her attempt to control perception had failed, and those looks, more than any words, underscored the transformation in power dynamics. She was no longer in control, and I didn't need to force her into submission or shame her publicly. The truth had already stripped her of that control. And for the first time in decades, I felt the liberation that comes from stepping out of someone else's shadow, from refusing to carry their secrets or cover their mistakes. As I continued to speak, I noticed a subtle change in the atmosphere, the way people shifted in their chairs, leaned in, nodded, asked clarifying questions, and I realized that the act of sharing truth calmly and with integrity carries a resonance far deeper than anger ever could. It doesn't humiliate, it enlightens. It doesn't provoke defensiveness, it invites understanding. And watching my family process what had happened, seeing them absorb the reality without judgment but with empathy, I understood that truth has a quiet, steady force that outlasts lies and manipulations. Elaine's attempts at justification gradually faded, because in a room full of witnesses with honesty flowing steadily from my side, her words sounded thin, flimsy, and ultimately powerless, and she realized it even if she didn't say it aloud. I saw the shift in her demeanor, the tension in her posture, the subtle clenching of her hands, and I knew that she understood that this was the final exposure of what had been hidden. There would be no retreats, no partial victories, no more illusions. I also realized something important about myself during that evening. Speaking the truth publicly, with dignity and composure, was not just an act of revelation but an act of self-respect, a reclamation of identity that betrayal had tried to erode. For years I had been living under a cloud of uncertainty, questioning myself, my judgment, my ability to perceive reality accurately. And as the truth was laid bare, I felt the weight of that uncertainty lift, replaced by clarity, by control over my own narrative. By the time the gathering wound down, Elaine and I had shared few words outside of the explanations, but the atmosphere had changed irrevocably. The truth was now part of our shared reality, and while the wounds were fresh and the emotions raw, there was also a strange peace in knowing that the burden of secrecy was no longer mine alone. People knew, and knowing is different from suspecting. It allows healing to begin, allows reflection to take root. Walking away from that gathering later that evening, I felt a sense of empowerment I hadn't expected. It wasn't a thrill of revenge or triumph over her. It was the quiet satisfaction of having acted with integrity, of having refused to let deception dictate my story, and of having allowed truth to take its rightful place. The power shift had occurred not through spectacle or confrontation, but through the deliberate, patient, calm choice to speak clearly and honestly. And in that choice, I found a sense of freedom that no betrayal could touch. That night, as I lay awake later, I thought about the subtle beauty of truth spoken calmly, about the difference between chaos and clarity, and about the fact that once reality is seen by others, once it exists in public consciousness, the manipulations, the secrets, the lies, all of them lose their strength. And for the first time in a long time, I understood that the end of her control over the story marked the beginning of my own control over life. And that was a victory far greater than anger, far more lasting than confrontation, and far more satisfying than any impulsive act of retribution could ever have been. The day I moved out, I woke up early, earlier than I had in years, before the sun even touched the horizon, and for the first time in a long time I felt an unfamiliar calm settling over me. There was no adrenaline, no rush of anger or panic, no need to argue or convince anyone of anything. The house was quiet, the walls familiar yet suddenly alien, and as I walked through the rooms one last time, I could feel the weight of decades pressing against me, heavy with memories, laughter, small arguments, celebrations, quiet nights and ordinary mornings that had once felt unremarkable but now shimmered with the poignancy of loss. And yet, beneath that weight, there was a strange, steady sense of freedom. I moved slowly, deliberately, taking each item in my hands and assessing it, deciding what I would carry forward and what I would leave behind. And I realized that this wasn't just about belongings. It was about reclaiming myself. Each shirt folded, each book stacked, each photograph carefully placed into a box was a small act of reclaiming a life that had been quietly invaded and reshaped by betrayal. I didn't rush, I didn't slam doors, I didn't shout or threaten, because I had learned that the loudest, most immediate forms of revenge leave echoes you carry long after the moment passes, and I didn't want those echoes. I wanted my own clarity, my own space to breathe, untainted by fury. I passed the living room, lingering on the couch where we had spent countless evenings, watching shows, talking, sometimes arguing but always together. The cushion still smelled faintly of her perfume, a scent I had once associated with comfort and intimacy, and now it hit me with a pang of grief that was sharp but not overwhelming. I let myself feel it, allowed it to wash over me, acknowledging that grief is not weakness. It is proof of investment, proof that I had truly loved, and there was dignity even in that pain. Packing my study was harder. Books lined the shelves, some marked with notes in the margins, reminders of long nights spent learning, laughing, planning, dreaming. Each one carried a memory of shared moments, of conversations that had once seemed trivial but now held weight I could never fully articulate. I thought about how years of shared life can build invisible threads between people, threads that even betrayal cannot entirely sever. And yet, I understood that my path forward required me to cut some of those threads carefully, with intention, so that I could step into a new life unburdened. As I moved through the kitchen, I caught a glimpse of the breakfast table where we had celebrated birthdays quietly, sometimes just the two of us, sometimes with the kids, and I remembered small victories and simple joys, the kind that rarely make the big story of life but that accumulate into the shape of it. I let myself smile at those memories for a moment, acknowledging their truth, their value, their impossibility of erasure. And then I exhaled deeply, preparing to leave behind the house, not the life I had lived but the version of it that had been intertwined with betrayal. I didn't look back when I stepped outside with the last box in my arms, and the morning air was cool against my skin, carrying the faint scent of dew and the promise of a day unshaped by past choices. I felt a sense of release, a clarity that comes when the decision to leave is not rushed or reactive, but deliberate and fully owned. I was not running from anger or pain. I was walking toward autonomy, toward a life defined not by what had happened to me, but by the way I chose to respond. I realized, as I loaded the boxes into my car, that revenge isn't about destroying someone else. It isn't about shouting, humiliating, or making them feel small. Revenge in its most potent form is about refusing to let another person's choices destroy you, refusing to surrender your sense of self, your dignity, your control over the narrative of your own life. I had discovered that truth in the quiet weeks after the anniversary dinner, and I carried it with me now as tangibly as the boxes in the backseat. Each item packed was a symbol not of what I had lost, but of what I still possessed: my integrity, my clarity, my freedom. Driving away from the house, I didn't glance in the rearview mirror, not because I was indifferent, but because I knew the past belonged behind me, and my focus was on the road ahead. I felt a mixture of sadness and relief, a strange cocktail of mourning and liberation that is difficult to articulate to anyone who hasn't lived through a betrayal so intimate, so prolonged, that it shakes the foundation of what you thought your life was. There was grief, yes, for the shared dreams that had quietly crumbled, for the life that could have been. But there was also exhilaration, the kind that comes when you reclaim the right to make choices solely for yourself again. I thought about the people who would later ask me why I didn't lash out, why I didn't humiliate her in front of friends, why I didn't make dramatic public scenes, and the answer was simple: I wanted my life back. Anger ties you to the past. Bitterness chains you to someone else's mistakes, and I refused to let her actions define the rest of my life. Walking away without hatred meant walking away with my power intact, with the ability to shape my future on my own terms, and I knew that the ultimate revenge, if it could be called that, would be a life lived fully, authentically, and without the weight of resentment. As I drove toward my new apartment, the city slowly waking around me, I felt a sense of quiet anticipation, a recognition that this was not an end but a beginning. I would rebuild piece by piece, day by day, focusing on myself, on my health, on friendships, on passions long neglected, and I understood that freedom is the truest form of reclamation. No dramatic confrontation, no public spectacle could have granted me what this quiet, deliberate step into autonomy had given: clarity, dignity, and peace. By the time I pulled into the parking garage of my new place, I was calm, steady, and centered, a state I had not achieved in decades. And as I stepped out of the car with the last of my boxes, I realized that leaving doesn't always require anger, that the most profound acts of self-respect are quiet, measured, and internal. and that sometimes the greatest power lies not in controlling others, but in reclaiming control over yourself. That morning, walking into a space that was entirely mine for the first time in years, I understood fully that I was free, not because she had made a mistake, but because I had refused to be defined by it. And in that freedom, I discovered a strength I had forgotten I possessed, a quiet, steady force that no betrayal could take from me.